to explain slavery and Reconstruction to readers of all ages. Henry Louis Gates will join us to talk about two of his new books, Stony the Road and Dark Sky Rising. What does our planet's future look like, and what can we do about it? David Wallace Wells will be here to discuss his best-selling book, The Uninhabitable Earth. April is National Poetry Month, and we have a special poetry reading for you. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Henry Louis Gates Jr. joins us now. He is everything, the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He is a filmmaker, an author or co-author of more than 24 books?
It's bad luck to count.
A winner of an Emmy, a Peabody, an NAACP Image Award, a MacArthur Fellow, and many more things. So I am honored and excited to have you on the podcast. Skip, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me.
You have three projects kind of going on simultaneously that are related, actually probably more than that. But the three I'm thinking of are your PBS series, Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, and then two books that we'll talk about today. One for children, Dark Sky Rising, Reconstruction and the Dawn of Jim Crow, which was written with Tanya Bolden. And then a new book, Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. How do these three projects relate, and sort of what was the order in which these developed?
I had three projects teed up with PBS, one on the Black Church, one on the Great Migration, and one on Reconstruction. But after the last general election, it occurred to me, and events that ensued, it occurred to me that we were living in Reconstruction Redemption Redux, and that the most important contribution I could make would be to tackle Reconstruction right away, because so many of the issues that are roiling our society today really played out after the 12-year period called Reconstruction, which followed the Civil War between 1865 and 1877. And then this massive rise of white supremacy, which rolled back Reconstruction and, in fact, did its best to reinstitute slavery. We might call it neo-slavery, by disenfranchising the new black male voters, because remember, only men could vote, and instituting new forms of economic bondage called sharecropping and peonage, and even convict leasing, which is the grandfather, one might say, of the mass incarceration that our society is inflicted with today. So I thought that we could make a positive civic contribution by tackling Reconstruction and this long, hideous rollback period called Redemption. And I wanted to do it with a book, an adult book, of course. And then I was approached by Scholastic about doing a book for adolescents. I have a granddaughter who's 4, so children's books are very much on my mind. You know, I'm trying to be a good granddaddy, so I go to Harvard Bookstore or Amazon and hit that one-click thing, and massive amounts of children's books arrive. And so I thought maybe I would tackle it and try my hand at a book for adolescents, because it was in the 8th grade that I first really fell in love with reading. And there's been no turning back, as they say. So that's what led to these three projects.
Well, I want to start with the children's book, because when I was growing up in, the 1970s, 1980s New York, it wasn't like I grew up in South Carolina. This period of history went from the Civil War to Reconstruction, which was largely told in the context of carpetbaggers. And then you skipped ahead to the Gilded Age. So you never talked about that rollback of rights, or what you refer to as redemption. You never really talk about, and you've mentioned this before in interviews, civil rights until you get to 1954.
That's right. And it was true in my school system. The Civil War was called the War Between the States. It was not fought to end slavery. It was fought to keep the Union together. And then in my generation, we skipped all the way from Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox, straight to the Civil Rights Movement. And schools did not even teach about Reconstruction, let alone redemption, leaving lots of us wondering why, if Lincoln freed the slaves, why do we need a civil rights movement? So you had a better, more sophisticated American history course, so at least you dealt with Reconstruction. But even, as you say, when Reconstruction was in the textbooks, it was seen as a massive failure. And it was a failure because of a conspiracy between unscrupulous scallywags and carpetbaggers, as they were called, and incompetent black people who were put in offices for which they were not qualified and which they did not deserve. And nothing could be further from the truth. Reconstruction was a glorious period, the first experiment in interracial democracy in America. Slavery was only ended ultimately, legally, by the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865, as we all know now because of Ava DuVernay's brilliant documentary. And it was followed by Andrew Johnson's presidential Reconstruction, which basically restored the Confederacy to its previous status. And when the radical Republicans finally got in office, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then 4 Reconstruction Acts in 1867, 1868. And they're important because they made the former slave citizens. Remember, there are 3.9 million African Americans enslaved in the 1860 federal census on the eve of the Civil War, a year before the Civil War breaks out. So they, because of Reconstruction Acts, were made citizens, and the men were given the right to vote. And the summer of 1867, I call the first Freedom Summer, echoing, of course, what happened in the Civil Rights Movement. Why do we call it that? 80.5% of the freedmen registered to vote in 10 of the 11 Confederate states. Tennessee had been restored to the Union. But the other 5 Confederate states had been divided into 5 military districts. And part of the rules were that these black people were now citizens. And remember, the Supreme Court in 1857 in Dred Scott had said no black person was a citizen, not even Frederick Douglass was a citizen, whether free or enslaved. And it gave them the right to vote. And these black people, and think about it, they were overwhelmingly illiterate, those who had been enslaved, because there were laws against teaching slaves to read and write. And nevertheless, they pursued the right to vote and the electoral process with alacrity. And 80.5% registered to vote. And then in 1868, 500,000 black men cast their votes overwhelmingly for the Republican candidate, Ulysses S. Grant. And though Grant won in a landslide in the Electoral College, he only won by 300,000 votes in the popular election, which means effectively that black men, former slaves by and large, had elected a president of the United States. And meanwhile, black people went on to elect 16 congressmen, 2 in the Senate, and 14 in the House between 1865 and 1877. And in South Carolina, one of the 3 black majority states, this is such a shock when I tell my students, but there were 3 states with majority black populations: South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And in South Carolina, there was actually a majority in its House of Representatives. And this, as you might imagine, did not sit well with the people who were former Confederates. And they were determined to roll this back. There were 8 massacres of black people, often related to their attempts to vote or hold office, between 1866 and 1876, starting in Memphis, Tennessee in 1866, and ending in Hamburg, South Carolina in 1876. There were also, unfortunately, rapes, beatings, lynchings. There's a rise of terrorism. The Klan is born at about the same time as the 13th Amendment is ratified. So parallel to this explosion of the embrace of citizenship among the black community was a harsh right-wing, alt-right rollback. And if you want the most apt comparison between Reconstruction. And today, Reconstruction was 12 years of maximum black freedom, followed by an alt-right rollback. And what does that remind you of? 8 years of the presence of a brilliant black president and a beautiful black family in the White House, followed by an alt-right rollback. So Reconstruction inspired a violent racist reaction, which led with the approval of the Supreme Court of the United States to the imposition of Jim Crow, which we know is separate but equal. And that was only overturned in the Civil Rights era with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965. So that the issue central to Reconstruction, who is a citizen? Who gets to be an American? Who has the right to vote? What is the role of terrorist violence in a democracy? And what's the relationship between economic and political democracy? Those issues continue to roil our society and politics today, making an understanding of Reconstruction and its rollback both timely and even more vital.
I want to ask you a question specifically about the political changes and the legal changes that happened on the state level subsequent to that peak in 1872, where you had those 16 members, African-American members of Congress, and that South Carolina state majority of African-Americans, to what essentially was a complete disenfranchisement of Black people until the 1950s, 1960s. I'm curious if at that time, if there was an awareness of that vote count for Ulysses Grant among African Americans, because it seems that not until the 1950s did the Republican and the Democratic parties sort of both become aware, oh, hey, these Northern Blacks are a significant voting bloc and we need to take them into account. In other words, did at the time the South recognize that Grant had won due to African Americans having the vote?
It was the apple cart turned upside down, and the former Confederates were alarmed because essentially they were powerless in certain states and in certain districts to outvote the blacks. Again, it was such a surprise that these former slaves who couldn't read and write would nevertheless vote and think of themselves with, oh my God, the audacity of being equal participants as citizens in the great republic of the United States. And so there were all sorts of machinations that began right away to intimidate Black people, to beat them up, to threaten to lynch them, to keep them from voting. And then after 1890, that's when the real rollback happened. Starting in 1890, the right wing figured out that you can't get rid of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Remember, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment established citizenship, birthright citizenship for the first time in the United States, and equal protection of the laws regardless of race. And then the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, gave all Black people the right to vote. Now, you might say, wait, if you just told me that Black people could vote because of the Reconstruction Act in 1867, right? But that only applied to freedmen in 10 of the 11 Confederate states. So here's the irony. It's such a shock. Black men who were free could only vote in the North, in the 5 New England states, and in New York if you had $250 worth of property. In every other state in the North, Black men could not vote until the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870. Now, I happen to descend from 3 sets of 4th great-grandparents who were free. So my family on 2 sides has been free. They were all Black people. They were free on 2 sides since the American Revolution. And on the 3rd side, they were freed since 1823. And they lived 30 miles from where I was born in what is now the state of West Virginia. I grew up in Piedmont, West Virginia. It's about halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington. And it's very near to the Virginia border. In fact, firecrackers were illegal in West Virginia. So on July 3rd, we would zip across the border to Virginia by firecrackers so we could set them off on the 4th of July. The irony is that my free black ancestors could not vote until 3 years after their enslaved cousins 30 miles away in the former Confederate state of Virginia could vote because of the Reconstruction Act. It's astonishing to people. We think of the North as this haven for black people, but there was a lot of discrimination in the North against the free black community. It was tiny, only 10%. Even as late as 1910, only 10% of all black Americans lived in the North. 90% lived in the South. And as you know from your former colleague Isabel Wilkerson's brilliant book about the Great Migration, in 1910, really, black people in the South got on the move, and they headed north. So the last Reconstruction congressman is basically kicked out of Congress in 1901, and he makes this beautiful speech about the Negro will rise again like the phoenix from the ashes. The next black man elected to Congress is Oscar DePriest in Chicago in 1929. He was only able to be elected because black people, particularly from Mississippi, those former freedmen and women, their descendants had migrated north to places like Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh and Milwaukee, etc. They had migrated to Chicago and comprised the majority in a district so they could elect a black man back to the Congress. And they were allowed to vote. They were able to vote because the 15th Amendment had been ratified. It is such an irony of American history, but that's true. All of these black people elected to Congress between 1865 and 1877 were from the South, not from the North. And there wouldn't be a Northern member of the House until 1929.
I want to ask you one final question. You've brought up a number of books and also parallels between this period, or the period of redemption, and our current time. And some of the authors of these recent books have been previous guests here on the podcast. David Blight, whose new biography of Frederick Douglass deals largely with this period. Steve Luxenberg, whose book Separate, The Story of Plessy versus Ferguson. Isabel Wilkerson, her book The Warmth of Other Suns. And then there are others. The New Negro, A Life of Alain Locke by Jeffrey Stewart. Eric Foner has a forthcoming book on those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Some of these books were worked on for years and predated the 2016 election, and others either were directly after or sort of shifted. The authors kind of shifted gears a bit after that election. I'm curious, why now? Why all of these books now?
By the way, when I make the film on the Great Migration, Isabel Wilkerson will be a major consultant. Jeffrey Stewart and I were at Yale together. The book that he published, which won the National Book Award, was his PhD thesis in 1979, the same year I got my PhD from the University of Cambridge. We had the same mentors.
Oh, wow.
And David Blight is an old friend, and I'm making a documentary about Frederick Douglass based on, we acquired the rights to David Blight. But when I decided to do Reconstruction, there was one person whom I had to enlist, and that was Eric Foner. Eric Foner, I can't say enough about him. He is the dean of Reconstruction studies. Now, Eric has been a lone voice, not a lone voice in the wilderness, but it's been his mission to retell the story of Reconstruction for years. I think this will be his 10th, the book to which you alluded on the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments, I think is his 10th book on Reconstruction. And you know why? Because the school of history that he is refuting was centered at Columbia under Professor Dunning. It's called the Dunning School. And it was as racist could be. And so Eric, it's like a personal mission for the Center for Reconstruction Studies to be at Columbia, so that he's showing that his predecessors at the turn of the century were not only wrong, but were complicit in this racist superstructure designed to denigrate black people. I think that to give you the short answer, it's because we realize that when we look up and see voter suppression, I remember when I woke up one day, turned on the news, and people in North Carolina, I think, were talking about that you needed to have voter IDs, that you needed to have a driver's license, or they were creating barriers to make it more difficult for people to register to vote. And I go, my God, this reminds me of the Mississippi Plan in 1890 and all those Southern state constitutional conventions. And by extension, other factors are recurring. A conservative Supreme Court. One of the reasons Reconstruction died is because the Supreme Court was so conservative. And in 1883, it said that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which gave black people the right to ride on trains in first-class cars, stay in hotels, eat in restaurants, it said that Civil Rights Act passed by Congress in 1875 was unconstitutional. And now we have a conservative court, and we're all fighting to keep affirmative action legal, the same affirmative action that made it possible for me to go to Yale. Why would I say that? Because I went to Yale in 1969, and with 95 other black men and women, including Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman from Houston, Kurt Schmoke, the first black mayor of Baltimore, Dr. Ben Carson was in my class. There were 96 of us. What's the big deal about that? The class of 66 at Yale had 6 black men. Affirmative action, the use of diversity as a value for the consideration of admission. That's the only reason you and I are having this conversation. The only reason I'm standing in the kitchen of a house in Harvard Square thinking about my class next week and not teaching at a historically black college or having attended an historically black college is because of affirmative action and because of a liberal court struck down separate but equal in 1954 in the Brown v. Board case, so that in 1956 I could start at the white school, as we called it, in first grade. And so voter suppression, a conservative court that is, I hope not going to overturn affirmative action, but could very well do that. The rise of terrorism, the shockingly open manner in which white supremacy is voicing itself, in particularly even during the Obama administration, but in reaction to a black president, but because they feel a certain license under the present administration to voice those heinous opinions. All of this, we've come full circle. And that's why so many scholars are writing about Reconstruction. They're doing it, one, to reclaim and recover the achievements that regular black people and elected black officials made during Reconstruction to counter the lies and propaganda about how incompetent they were, but also as a warning sign to the society that our rights are fragile. The things that we think are eternal can be rolled back, boom, just like that. Just like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were qualified by the actions of the Southern Democratic State Constitutional Conventions.
There are definite parallels there. I could talk to you about this for a very long time, and I'm sure our listeners could keep listening, but I should let you go. I'm so glad that you were here to talk about both of these books, Dark Sky Rising, Reconstruction and the Dawn of Jim Crow, written together with Tanya Bolden, and Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. Skip, thank you again.
Thank you. It was fun.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time.
This is Greg Coles, the Book Review's poetry editor. For National Poetry Month, we've been inviting poets onto the podcast each week to read a poem by a favorite poet. This week, Ada Limon, author most recently of the collection The Carrying, reads Muriel Rukeyser's Waiting for Icarus.
He said he would be back and we'd drink wine together. He said that everything would be better than before. He said we were on the edge of a new relation. He said he would never again cringe before his father. He said he was going to invent full time. He said he loved me, that going into me, he said, was going into the world and the sky. He said all the buckles were very firm. He said the wax was the best wax. He said, wait for me here on the beach. He said, just don't cry. I remember the gulls and the waves. I remember the islands going dark on the sea. I remember the girls laughing. I remember they said he only wanted to get away from me. I remember Mother saying inventors are like poets, a trashy lot. I remember she told me those who try out inventions are worse. I remember she added, women who love such are the worst of all. I have been waiting all day, or perhaps longer. I would have liked to try those wings myself. It would have been better than this.
David Wallace Wells joins us now. He is a National Fellow at the New America Foundation, a deputy editor of New York Magazine, and now the author of a New York Times bestselling book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. David, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this started off as an article for New York Magazine. Let's talk about the genesis of that story and sort of then what happened after it came out.
I started in 2016 seeing a lot of really scary research from climate science. I'm a journalist who's had not been focused on climate, but sort of interested in the near future and following the news from the Academy, semi-regularly. And I saw all of these new bits of research that felt really terrifying to me as a kind of layperson, and which I didn't see reflected, this kind of terror that I felt, didn't see it reflected in other newspapers, magazines, TV programs that covered climate, which we at New York think of as our kind of, broadly speaking, our competitors. And I thought that there was a kind of a new story to tell about climate, one that hadn't really been told before, which I felt was distinguished in sort of three ways. And the first is the speed of the story. We were all, I think, kind of raised to believe that climate change was a very slow-moving phenomenon. In fact, scientists often complained that the public wasn't worried enough about it because it was so slow. But in fact, half of all the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere since the beginning of time from the burning of fossil fuels have happened in the last 30 years.
You did it to Seinfeld.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 36 years old, so this story is really contained in my lifetime. I have memories that go back farther than 30 years. I have memories of producing carbon that go back 30 years, taking cars and taking planes. My life contains this whole story. When I was born, the planet was basically stable. There were scientists who were worried about the distant future, but in the near term, nobody was all that concerned. And now we're at the brink of catastrophe just 30 years later. That's because of what's happened in that interim period. And we're beginning to see the effects in terms of extreme weather in real time. So the speed was one big thing I thought had not been told adequately. The second was the scope. I was, again, led to believe that that's a bit of a charged phrase, but I do feel like it's
I want to go back to that phrase.
Accurate. That, this is a matter mostly of Arctic ice and Antarctic ice and sea level rise. And so if you lived off the coast, you could sort of feel safe. But the more I learned about all of the new research coming out about climate change, from economic impacts, which say that the global GDP could be 30% smaller than it would be without climate change by the end of the century. That's an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression. To violence, there's a relationship between temperature and conflict, so that, again, if we don't change course, we could have twice as much war as we have today. Agricultural yields could be half as bountiful, and we'd be using them to feed 50% more people. Really, the more you learn about it, the more you see that the impacts are everywhere, no matter where you are, no matter how rich you are, no matter how urban your life is. We all live within nature, and when it is disturbed, our lives will be disturbed as well. And then the third big misunderstanding that I had, and I think many people like me had, was about the severity. We heard a lot about this level of warming 2 degrees, which we were told we really had to avoid. The scientists called it the threshold of catastrophe. The island nations of the world call it genocide. And I think the lay reader would have reasonably concluded that it was about, therefore, a worst-case scenario. But in fact, it's something more like our best case situation, and we're on track for more than 4 degrees of warming this century. And no one had really sketched out what that gap, that 2 degrees to 4 degrees, would look like in any detail. My article was actually focused on truly worst case scenarios, sort of north of 4 degrees. And the book is much more focused rigorously on that 2 to 4 degree range. But that range isn't much less scary than the 5, 6, 7 degree levels. And even beyond sketching out what the science means, what I think the book does that is so interesting and sort of original, most interesting to me at least, is that it gets beyond the question of some of these impacts to think about what it will mean for the way that we live together on this planet, what it will mean for our politics and our geopolitics, what it will mean for our relationship to capitalism and to technology. And I do think that this is a century, the 21st century, which will be defined by these forces in very profound ways, almost no matter what we do. Because even if we avoid some of these worst case outcomes, it will mean literally rebuilding the face of the planet so that there'll be plantations of solar panels everywhere and carbon sucking machines, and our infrastructure will be completely different, and our fleets of airplanes will be remade, and our public transportation will be different, and the way that we grow our food will be different, and the way we eat will be different. So even if we do everything we can, the UN says we need to mobilize at the scale of World War II starting this year to avoid this catastrophic level of warming. Even if we do that and avoid some of these most horrifying impacts, the world will still be remade by climate change in a kind of a shadow way.
All right, I'm going to take a deep breath and avoid being terrified by everything that you just said for a few minutes. I want to come back to some of the specifics. But getting back to the genesis of that New York Magazine article, which then became the sort of basis of this book, did you feel like because you were coming at this as a kind of outsider who hadn't been immersed in climate change journalism and science writing for decades, like many people have been, was that an advantage in a way?
I think huge. I mean, the first thing is that I was able to write it from scratch. Mm-hmm. So even that story was quite total in its portrait. And I think that when you add up some of the sort of misapprehensions that I was trying to correct, they give you a sense of this all-encompassing story. It's everywhere on the planet. We're all involved. It will affect all of us, even though it will punish us in discriminating ways, which we can talk about later. It's everywhere, and we're all involved. And the scale of that story, which is something that I felt, we used to only really recognize in mythology and theology. We have the fate of the planet in our hands, literally your hands, my hands, the hands of every listener. That will be determined over the next 30 years in our lifetimes. That's incredible. But I was able to tell the scale of that story because I was writing a sort of a primer from zero for readers who were coming to it fresh, as I was. That was one advantage. Another thing was that I was not beholden to the conventional wisdom about how to tell this story. I had different ideas. And the article actually generated some fair amount of criticism as a result because it was considered too alarmist, more alarmist than most climate writers and most climate scientists were comfortable being. The book has generated actually a lot less of that, I think, because the conversation has really changed around climate over the last year. But at the time, it was considered quite radical to talk openly about the scariest aspects of what climate science was projecting. My feeling is, if the science is scary, it's responsible to be scared. You shouldn't call someone who's sharing that knowledge an alarmist if the facts themselves are alarming.
It sounds like your initial response was to a degree emotional, that maybe that is what infused the story that resulted in New York Magazine, which perhaps isn't an advantage because in general, when we talk about climate change and these other extremely large-scale problems, what tends to happen is that people sort of say, okay, we know it's terrible. What should I have for breakfast? And it's very easy to kind of put it out of mind. And there's a kind of assumption, which I don't think is correct, at least looking at our bestseller lists, that people don't want to read about climate change anymore, that they kind of know that they're scared, that they're over it, that it's easy to kind of compartmentalize and put it away. How, as a storyteller, not only in that piece, but also in this book, do you kind of overcome that resistance, that urge that people have to kind of shut this conversation out?
Well, one way is to be honest about those impulses and to write about them too. I mean, I think this book is one of the things that it does differently than a lot of other books that have tackled climate change is that it talks about the way that we live under the sign of warming and will live in the future under the sign of continued warming. And one of the deep truths about that is that we are all really reluctant to look at scary facts about our future. We have emotional and intellectual biases that push us to have a more optimistic read and to assume that everything's going to work itself out. I think that works on all of us as individuals. It even works on me as someone who has spent 3 years really deep in the science. I still compartmentalize. I still live mostly in denial. I think all of us do. But it also works at the level of our politics. It works at the level of our international arrangements. Really, at every level, we're sort of bedeviled by all of these status quo biases and reluctance to believe that anything scary is possible. In part, I think that's because, I speak a little bit for myself here. I'm a child of the 90s, really am in a certain profound way a kind of end of history kid. And even if I would have argued with you, even as a teenager, if you told me, well, markets are going to make everything better and globalization is pure force for good, I didn't think that those things were true. They also nevertheless formed a kind of my core emotional relationship to the world. And now I look around and say, wow, very quickly we may collectively stop thinking that the future is a time of increased prosperity and affluence and happiness, and in fact start romanticizing the past, which is a quite profound reversal from at least the way that most people in the wealthy West have thought about their world and their own lives for at least a few decades, and in many cases for a century or two.
Does that get into that phrase, that you were led to believe certain things? Is it about sort of overcoming that kind of general cultural message?
I think the general cultural message is a big part of that, but I also think that the writing about climate itself was a problem in that because scientists and science journalists were so worried about scaring people too much and felt they sort of put together a rhetorical guidebook based on some thin social science that people really wanted to hear about hope and optimism and would be motivated more by messages that were dominated by hope and optimism than by fear and alarm. It meant that they were really editing their stories quite aggressively. And, I felt as someone who was personally awakened by fear, I knew at least I had a case study of one that showed me that fear could be motivating and mobilizing. But I also looked back at the history of environmental advocacy and other kinds of mobilization and activism and saw it wasn't the case that fear-mongering was the only message, but it was certainly part of the message. And I thought, why are people who are worried about climate change leaving this rhetorical tool on the table?
Is part of the problem that people have such difficulty understanding statistics and sort of assessing the risks embedded in those statistics? Even when you say something like 30% GDP reduction, people think, oh, well, terrible for them. Or even if you talk about something like a 2 to 4 degree increase in average temperatures, you'll have people in rural South Dakota saying, I would love to have a milder winter. That sounds like great news to me.
Yeah, that has been a problem. I think each of these data points can be illustrated by analogy extremely clearly. So 30% of GDP, what does that mean? Well, it's an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it's permanent. The second half of that sentence is just as important as the first half. There's a paper that I talk about a lot showing the impact of air pollution just between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, just in that 1/2 degree difference of global temperature. The effect on just through air pollution would be adding 153 million additional deaths. Now, that's a number, and it may seem abstract, but then if you continue and say that's dying at the scale of 25 Holocausts, again, that analogy really drives it home. One interesting thing about that statistic is when I mention it to people, almost always their eyes go big, their skin goes ashen. They think this is an unconscionable level of suffering. We can't possibly allow that to happen. Of course, it is unconscionable and we should feel that way. But 9 million people are already dying every year from air pollution. To me, that is incredibly illustrative, which is that when we think about what climate change is going to look like at 3 degrees, at 4 degrees, it's a horror show to us. It seems impossible that civilization would endure. From my perspective, civilization will endure, humans will adapt, and the likeliest outcome is that we normalize a lot of this suffering in the same way that we're already normalizing the suffering that goes on around the world, especially by the global poor. And that's on some level the subject of my book, not just what climate change will do to the planet, but how it will really transform the way that we live so that our grandchildren will still think of their lives as normal, even if they're living in a world where places could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once, or the California wildfires could be 64 times worse than they are today.
When you did your piece for New York Magazine, it was a huge viral sensation, and kind of stood out in a landscape in which there are lots of people doing substantive reporting on climate change, including here at the Times and at many other news outlets. I think part of the reason that it hit such a chord was in the style of the writing. And I'm curious, when you decided to take that and expand it into a book, what was your approach as a writer? You have worked at the Paris Review, you work at New York Magazine, which is not only noted for its journalism, but the stylishness of the writing. Sort of what was the challenge for you in terms of how do you get people to engage with this and read an entire book about the subject?
Well, it sort of sounds narcissistic to say, but my main method was to try to recreate the experience that I had as someone who is following climate change now quite closely of reading Twitter, which is to say, my Twitter feed is more dominated by climate than just about anybody's. And I would just look at it and it would just be one piece of bad news after the other. I mean, I've been looking at this stuff for a few years now. The number of good news reports that I've read, I could probably count on my two hands. The number of bad news.
This one bird has survived.
There are little bits of progress here and there, and science being science, it's always revised. Sometimes it's being revised in a more optimistic direction, but overwhelmingly, the research is pushing us towards bleaker and bleaker projections. And I actually wanted that feeling of being overwhelmed by the data, overwhelmed by the new research, to be the experience of reading that science. Because to me, as I say, science changes. I don't think that every projection that I quote in this book or cite in this book is going to be a gold standard projection that comes to pass precisely as the scientists articulated. But if you think that this is a book of several hundred pages, many of which are filled sentence by sentence, each sentence a summary of a different scary paper, there can be a huge margin for error without us ending up anywhere that you and I would consider livable or happy in the future. And I think that impact, the pure volume of the research, I really wanted to sort of lay onto the reader as it had been laid onto me.
You recently became a father for the first time. You have a 13-month-old daughter. How do you feel about this, sort of bringing someone into this world? Do you feel like your message to her is one of optimism, one of terror?
Well, I think on some level, it's a reflection that I also live in compartmentalization and denial. I think the world will get considerably uglier almost no matter what we do. And I think that Rocco will be living in that world, and that's a shame. But I also think that on climate, the truth is it's all up to us. The driver of climate change is what we do going forward. The flip side of the speed of climate change that I talked about earlier is that it's up to us over the next few decades to really shape the future of the planet. Our hands are on those levers. We can choose to emit less carbon, hopefully zero carbon relatively soon, or we can continue to go down the path that we're on now. And if we do get to a truly hellish outcome, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, it will be because of what we do. It won't be because of forces outside of our control. It won't be because of what our ancestors did. It is on us very profoundly. And I think personally, that's an empowering message. This is a responsibility we used to assign to gods. We have it ourselves. And even though the spectacle of horror that is possible at, say, 4 degrees is so large it can feel paralyzing, ultimately it's a reflection of the power that we all have over the climate. Because those hurricanes, those wildfires, those famines, they will happen only if we bring them into being. If we choose not to, they won't happen. And that is, I think, the message that I'm not yet talking to Raka about the climate, she's just one, but that is the message that I hope she grows up with, that everything is within our power and we need to fight to make the world the one we want to live in rather than let forces beyond our control shape that world for us. Because if we do that, it's going to be a lot uglier than we'd want to see.
All right, let us end on that galvanizing note. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
David Wallace Wells is the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleague Greg Coles and 2 special guest stars, Wesley Morris and Taffy Brodesser-Akner. Hey, guys.
Hello.
Hi, Pamela.
Hello.
All right, let's start with you, Wesley. Wesley is also the host of Still Processing, which I'm sure everyone here is listening to, and if not, they should.
Well, we're on a break, so you have no obligation to listen. There's old episodes.
You can catch up.
Yeah, you can catch up.
What are you reading?
Well, I'm reading for the second time George Schillier's Black No More. And it is a race satire from 1931. George Schiller was a Black American man who began his life as a writer with what I previously described to Greg earlier as like the inevitable politics of a Black person in the 1930s. You know, was in favor of all of the things that benefited Black people, believed racism was real and a problem and, you know, should be eliminated from the face of the earth. And at some point, he winds up sharing space and not exactly ideology with Marcus Garvey and the Garveyites, the sort of Back to Africa movement. And out of some confluence of his being a journalist and his being near and in proximity with Marcus Garvey, I mean, who knows exactly where this novel came from, but it had to have come out of that because it is a satire of it makes good on its promise. Black no more. Some wackadoo science outfit comes up with a plan to give Black people a procedure that will just turn them white. Instead of going back to Africa, Garvey style, you just get this procedure and you are made white. Right. And white America is freaking out. I mean, the prescience of this book in some ways in terms of white paranoia and the fear of losing what you have unrightfully not even earned, had been given, been bequeathed as a white person is real. But there's also just this satire against Black people and how they recognize that Blackness or being Black, and not so much Blackness, but the condition of being Black in the United States is so terrible that you'd instantly, unthinkingly, no-brainerly have this procedure.
I'm going to use that adverb moving forward, if that's okay with you.
Good luck.
Was this just reissued by Penguin Classics? Yes, because they've been doing a really nice job of going back and kind of reissuing, especially from diverse writers, books that were sort of previously overlooked and had gone out of print.
I had never heard of this book, but the amazing thing about it, can I just read one little part of it? It's about the moral and conditional logic of having this procedure. I don't have the book with me, but I've been keeping like notes for my own personal purposes, which I'll explain in some future conversation. But at some point in chapter 5, there's this line that basically sums it all up. It goes, "Why should anybody in the Negro race want to go back to Africa at a cost of $500 when they could stay in America and get white for $50?" I mean,
that's crazy that was written in 1931.
1931. Wow. Is the book great? It's not great, but it is funny and it's blunt. By my math, every 40 years we get a great race satire. So
there's only one every 40 years.
A great literary race satire written by a Black person, by a Black male.
Was the last one, to your mind, The Sellout?
Yes. So that was, and so 40 years before that, there was Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed. And none of these books is coherent. None of them really have a plot you can like sink your teeth into, but the observations about human behavior and the politics of race and the farce of race and the fantasy of race at both ends of the spectrum. And Paul Beatty is sort of more thinking about all of the races in between Black and white or in addition to Black and white. But it is essentially a Black-white satire mostly aimed at Blackness and the construction of a Black self. But anyway, this book is fascinating. And it's fascinating also because it's from 1931. The thing about George Schiller also is that he becomes like a very conservative Black person who, while still recognizing that racism is a problem, gives into this idea that he does not believe the federal government has a right to legislate fairness and equality because that is something that white people have to figure out for themselves. The government can't be made to do it. And in a weird way, dude was right. There's no federal law that's going to make white people be less racist. But that's not what the laws were about. The laws are about granting Black people equal rights. White people can do whatever they want. There'll be consequences for you not obeying the law, but the law is there for Black people's protection, not for white people's minds to be changed. But he became a conservative who really believed that the government was coddling Black people and making it going into the private lives of white people. And that was just a problem for him. I mean, the politics of the person he would become are in this book. It feels very conservative to me and very anti-Black in a strange way. Because the reason not anti-Black, but the reason that the protagonist winds up getting the procedure for himself is to win back some white woman who spurns him when he's Black. And it works.
Okay.
These books
it's a
all
romantic
end in
book.
chaos. And
They start in chaos.
And disaster.
All right. Where does your book end, Greg?
I can't tell you yet where it ends, but it begins in chaos and in disaster. I'm reading a novel called Women Talking by Miriam Toews. That's Toews, Toews. It's a book that grows out of a real-life incident. Toews is a former Mennonite and who writes often about the Mennonite community in her novels. And this grows out of an incident in Bolivia in the early of the 2000s where men in this isolated Mennonite community were in the middle of the night spraying women with an animal anesthetic to knock them completely unconscious and then raping them. Hundreds of women in the community based on the novel. I'm not sure of the specifics of the real life case, but I do know in real life it was girls as young as like 3 and grandmothers. And it was just this epidemic. And Miriam Toews has written a novel in which that has just happened and is in the past, and the men have been arrested, turned into the police by the kind of the elder of the community, who is not inclined to turn them into the police, but does it for their own protection because one of the men has been killed in retribution for this, and the fear is that the rest will be, and so to protect them, they involve the police. And while the men of the village are off paroling them and bringing them back and trying to bring them back into the community, the women convene to figure out, should we forgive them? Should we attack them when they come back? Should we leave the community and go out into the world that we know nothing of? There are just 8 women representing 2 families who've been left to be the ones to make this decision. The other women all say we want nothing to do with it, or we're fine if things just go on as they did before. But these 8, one of the families really favors just staying and fighting and kind of trying to reform the community from within. And the other family, the other 4, favor leaving and getting out. And so it almost feels like a play because it takes place just in this one weekend, and it's just 8 women, and there were 8 attackers, and so you have this balance. And Miriam Toews is really a comic novelist, and she has been throughout her career, and this remains a comic novel, but about horrific subject matter. And so she writes it with just a very light touch. In some ways, it's a comedy of bureaucracy. It's like a city council meeting with this bickering between the families and these long tangents. And behind it, you can sense Toews's delight in absurdity, but it's about these kind of deadly serious topics of retribution and justice and salvation. It feels very real to these women, whether they'll get into heaven or not. And so it's, taking place in this religious sect. Given the tight parameters, it's easy to imagine it adapted for the stage. It's almost a play as much as a novel. Taffy, what are you reading?
Well, I was reading several things when I, at the train station the other morning in the giveaway roundabout thing.
You have a giveaway roundabout thing at your train station?
Yes, and I live in fear of seeing my own book in it. Like
It will
on
happen.
every giveaway
Taffy is the
table.
author of a forthcoming novel called Fleischman is in Trouble.
Oh, thank you for bringing
Brought
that
to you
up.
by
I hadn't meant to.
TaffyBrodesser.com.
Industries.
If
yeah.
you do see if you do see your book in the giveaway, you have to sign it and put it back.
Oh, that's a great advice.
No, I've watermarked all of them so that I can confront the person who. So what happened was something that happens with a lot of books for me. I reread a lot of books. I feel like it has stopped me from advancing as a reader. That every time I have a beautiful and glorious and complete emotional experience with any piece of art, a song, a play, very much a novel, I just read it over and over to figure out how it did that, why it did that to me, and it's how I learned how to write. In 2012, I decided to become someone who walks a lot. It didn't take. But for a while, I was someone who walked, and I downloaded the audiobook Beautiful Ruins.
Okay.
The way the walking ends is that I finish it in my car in the driveway.
Was this his most recent book?
This is his most recent book. It's
He
from
did have a
2012.
story collection after this.
Oh.
But this
Yes,
is the
he
most
did.
recent novel.
This is his most recent novel. I read it. I audio read it, and it was a great audio read. The narrator was a man named Eduardo Bellerini.
Ooh,
And
I
he-
like him. I've got a whole collection of audio book readers that I love,
Yep.
whose voices.
Me
anyway.
too. He's one
Future
of them.
segment. Future segment.
I'll be on that segment because I have ones I won't listen to. I'll say,
Oh.
is there an alter? anyway, this book has. Whenever I encounter it, I will stop what I am doing and just start reading it again. This book it's called Beautiful Ruins. It's beautiful. It has this unsparing beauty that I've tried to understand over and over. It's about life and the things that you regret and how to live your life in the first place and revisiting parts of your life where you did bad things. And every single character is utterly ridiculous. And yet every single character is treated with so much love and adoration in their ridiculousness that I feel like I learned how to write profiles that way, to like see someone in their honest way and still apply love to them makes the entire enterprise a forgiving enterprise, meaning that you're not a horrible person for seeing someone as they are and still telling their story.
Right.
If you also figure out a way to love whatever kind of human they are. So I stop and I read this book over and over, and now I'm just reading it again. And now I'm finding all these new things. And he's so brilliant in the way he does his beginning, middle, and end, and the way every single thing he lays out in the beginning comes back in the end in this kind of beautiful montage that in my car, I was sitting there with my hand over my heart. And before I even went into the house, I went to his website and I wrote to him and I said, I want to write a novel one day and I want it to be beautiful like this. And I don't think I'll ever be able to do it. And he wrote back almost immediately and said, I thought that too. And I thought it was the kindest thing anyone has ever said after a book because a lot of people say that about books I didn't love. And I'm like, I don't know.
All right,
I
so
don't know.
listeners, if you read Taffy's forthcoming novel, you will know now
Fleischman
that
is in
if you
trouble.
write her, she will write back. Otherwise, she'll feel extremely guilty.
So bad. So bad.
Pamela, what are you reading?
So I just finished this book called The Beneficiary, Fortune, Misfortune, and the Story of My Father by Jenny Scott, who is a former Times reporter. And for people who are sort of deep into Times history, also the wife of Joe Lelyveld, former executive editor of the Times.
Times gossip. I didn't
This
know
is
that.
deep gossip. And actually, weirdly, last episode, people know I also read a deep, long ago gossip book about the New York Times, which was Hard News by Seth Mnookin. So there was a weird Joe Lelyveld overlap between these two. But this is the story of Jenny Scott's family, which is a very prominent Philadelphia mainline family. And it is a culture about which I know nothing.
I'm from Philadelphia.
Yes.
and I also know nothing.
Really?
That's how they won it.
Yes. Well, it's funny. I was watching recently with two of my kids Rear Window, and when they heard Grace Kelly speak, they were like, what is this way that she is speaking? Where is she from? And I was like, well, it is
Bryn Mawr.
a mid-Atlantic, but also Bryn Mawr accent.
Right.
So these are Jenny Scott's people, and she does a biography primarily of her father, who is the beneficiary in the title, a man named Robert Montgomery Scott, who is a former president of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And also the product of a marriage between sort of two major Philadelphia families. His mother was Helen Hope Montgomery, who was the model for the Katharine Hepburn character Tracy Lord in the Philadelphia Story. And yes, and her father was called Robert Montgomery, but was called the Colonel. On Robert Montgomery Scott's father's side, his father was a man named Edgar Scott, who was a descendant of Thomas Scott, who was one of the original railroad barons and the original first employer of Andrew Carnegie. So like way back. And so to me, it was fascinating mostly as social history. Like I remember when I first went to college, I had never really encountered the kind of New England WASP subculture of this country that, I didn't know that people willingly went to boarding schools before I went to college. I thought that was like a Dickensian thing that had been subsequently outlawed along with child labor. And, so I felt a similar experience reading this where I was just like, this is a completely new strata of society to me. They all had houses on the main line, and then they also all summered in Bal Harbor, and then they also had houses in South Carolina, plantations, where they could sort of like embody some weird old South thing. And the best part of the book is the way in which she evokes this particular strain of American society that it really has entirely vanished. And you can draw comparisons between, the era of the robber barons and the Gilded Age and the vast inequities that existed then with our current period now, and sort of contrast what the rich did for fun and pleasure and money spending then versus what they did now. It's not that different. It's just exponentially more. But the deeper story is about her father, who was a person who really remained unknown to her until the end of his life. And I don't think I'm revealing anything in saying that he was an alcoholic, and that throughout the course of this incredible wealth and life of ease that this family had, there was also like terrible strains of depression and alcoholism that ran through it. And so it's The Beneficiary by Jenny Scott.
It sounds fascinating.
I recommend it. Let's go quickly through the books again. Wesley, you read?
Black No More by George Schiller.
I read Women Talking by Miriam Taves.
I'm reading Beautiful Ruins by Jess Walter.
And The Beneficiary, Fortune, Misfortune, and the Story of My Father by Jenny Scott. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.